All right, who could prophesy? Most importantly, a person had to prepare himself. He had to be a person who was physically sound and mentally sound and have great intellect and wise character. And he had to have the desire to prophesy in order to have a closer connection with God. It couldn't be for any other reason. Now, all of these qualifications, they didn't mean that he would prophesy. These things had to be fulfilled just in order to get away the blockages that would prevent him from prophesying, but it didn't mean that he would be chosen to be a prophet. Prophecy was a state that men and women had to work very hard to reach. They had to undergo training to learn how to be a prophet. Sometimes, even after going through intensive training, they would still never reach the level of prophecy. How do we know this? In the Bible, there is a group of people called the B'nai Nevi'im. This is translated as the disciples of the prophets. You'll see this several times in the Bible, with a notable story in 2 Kings chapter 4, verse 1, and the famous story of Elisha and the woman and the jugs of oil. You see, her husband had died, and her husband was one of these prophets in training. He had been one of the disciples of the prophets. Prophets in training didn't have to learn only how to prepare themselves for prophecy, but they also had to learn how to recognize the onset of prophecy and how to distinguish between a real prophecy and a fake prophecy that was coming from evil forces. And all of this took experience and training under a qualified prophet. A really great example of this is in 1 Samuel chapter 3, in which Samuel is training underneath the prophet and priest Eli. The very first verse tells us, "And the lad Samuel was serving the Lord before Eli. Now the word of the Lord was withheld in those days. Vision had not broken through." That means Samuel had not yet received his first prophecy. This chapter tells us that when prophecy began to descend upon him, Samuel didn't even realize it. He heard a voice calling him and he didn't recognize who it was coming from. Only when Eli told him that he was about to receive a vision and told him to prepare for it, was Samuel able to prepare for that vision and receive it. After this experience, chapter 3, verse 20 tells us that in all Israel, from Dan to Beersheba, knew that Samuel was established as a prophet to the Lord. He went through the whole process and he became a qualified legal prophet who the Jewish people could trust to prophesy. Now, prophecy wasn't limited by age, and in fact, some of the very famous prophets of the Bible were very young when they began to prophesy. Think of Daniel, who was in his teens when he was prophesying. Prophecy also wasn't limited by gender, and in fact, there are 7 female prophetesses in the Bible, and one of them, Esther, actually wrote an entire book in the Bible. Now, here's another very interesting point. People often think of prophets as harbingers of doom, but that's not true. Many times prophets had positive prophecies to relate to people, such as when Isaiah went to Ahaz and comforted him over an impending war. That's in chapter 7 of Isaiah. Other times, prophets had to deliver very difficult messages, and they didn't delight in the task. In fact, you can look at Jonah, who tried to escape giving over this painful prophecy. The truth is that prophets had to be generally optimistic people, people with good natures, people who looked at the world with a good eye. And in fact, prophecy could not descend upon a person when he was in a state of melancholy. For that reason, prophets very frequently used musical instruments to move them to a state where they were in that emotional place where they could be happy and content and receive the prophetic word of God. You can see an example of this in 2 Kings chapter 3, verse 5, when Elisha calls for musicians and he says, "And now fetch me a musician." And it was that when the musician played, the hand of the Lord came upon him. There are many of these examples in the Bible. All in all, prophecy required a certain type of person who was of strong character, who had overcome all of his inclinations, who was wise, who was kind, who was happy, who was intellectual, who was subjugated to God, and who just wanted to be a vessel for God's message to come to the world. The average person was not fit for prophecy because we are warring with just different human natures, but prophets were people who had risen above that. Now, just a reminder of what I said earlier, just because somebody made themselves fit for prophecy, it didn't mean that they were going to be chosen for prophecy. That was entirely in God's hands. Up next, we'll discuss how some of the specifics that apply to all prophets, aside from Moses, actually didn't apply to Moses himself. He was in a special realm of prophecy. We'll discuss that in the upcoming video.